I'm looking forward to what you're
Awesome. So yeah, thanks. um, so it's really funny. Nevin and I have worked on researchy stuff and adventure therapy stuff for I don't know, 6, 7 years now. We've been collaborating and writing, and it's always great to have a good writing partner, especially one that's awake when you're not, because you wake up and you can dive into something, and then when you go to sleep, they're waking up to dive into something. So it just like keeps evolving, keeps evolving. It's really nice. And the funny thing is, it actually has been, at least for me, an actual overproductive, like too much writing and editing over the last few years. And I think part of that, I had the benefit of, being, not that COVID was great, but having time, a lot of us got a lot more time on our hands. And so being able to write and work on these projects. But I know for me, this Nevin did this book with colleagues from Human Nature in British Columbia, and they wrote this nature-based therapy book. And then Nevin and I did this edited book with a collection of different types of outdoor therapies. And then I did the solution-focused book with Stefan, and after that, that was a real kind of amazing process. And then I went, yeah, no more. That's enough for a few years. Like, that's a boatload of work. And of course, Nevin and I started talking, and we sort of went, I think we have to talk about this other side of things. And so that is sort of where this project came from. That will turn into another book that is actually, I don't know if you find this, Nevin, it's been probably one of the fastest things we've ever sort of compiled. Like, as in, it's not in a perfect draft by any means, but it really is growing exponentially. Would you say that?
Yes, and it also reflects conversations that have been building and percolating over the years as well. And I think when you have conversations that last years and years, and then you finally get to a point where it becomes a project, it's something that's defined. It's not as much work to start pulling it together, because a lot of it is already sitting in some part of your brain that's just ready to drop. Also, and you're going to speak to this, the fact that we've accessed a dozen experts, right?
Yeah. Well, and that was the thing that I thought was, I remember we kept talking about it, and I'm being very cryptic here for a second. And then I kept staring at blank pages and writing things that we're not going to use now. And then we did go out, and Nevin really spearheaded this, talking to experts in the field. And so you might not know these people's faces very much, but they're all, in their own right, really amazing, and also in different places of the spectrum of thinking about young people and well-being. So on the top left is Gordon Neufeld. He wrote a book it was the first book Gabor Mate was the co-author on. And this book is called Hold On to Your Kids. It's a good book. He's kind of a Canadian legend, Nevin. So do you want to say something to him?
Well, Gordon Neufeld is known as a parenting guru, although he hates the term. He is someone who has a long history as a psychiatrist working with high risk, high needs youth, whether that's in care, in corrections, but has been sort of on the front lines the whole time, and has been able to transfer all the knowledge that he's gained in the field into working with communities and families and parents specifically, and has built up basically, one of the top international training centers for parents, and has been training trainers now to multiply and expand that work forever. And his name is not a household name, but if anybody dips in just a little bit into that area of like, what can we learn from people out there about parenting in general? And he's almost like a common factors of parenting guru. Might be a way to put it.
Yeah. And then below I'm not going to go through all of these because some of them are relevant in different ways and not necessarily relevant to this talk. But this is the thing that's really interesting is we're almost doing this like pseudo qualitative research project just with these random experts. Maggie Dent is below there. For those in Australia will probably know Maggie Dent. She is the author of such books like From Boys to Men, which I've blurred my background, so you can't see. But From Boys to Men, this is an airport book, as we like to say. So Maggie's work makes it to the Australia airports. And the funny thing about interviewing Maggie is she brought up so many of these people as, oh, you have to talk to this person. Yeah. It's like, yeah, Maggie, we've already got that one. We've got that one. So going up with the bright red hair is Murray Swingle, author of iMinds, as in like the iPhone, iMinds. And that's a book about the impact of technology. Below that, Scott Miller. He's a psychotherapy researcher and quite a prolific one in understanding how psychotherapy works. Ellen Sandcedar, did I say that right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're good.
Ellen's a Scandinavian researcher, all in rough and tumble play, risky play, outdoor play, bringing back nature-based playgrounds, this sort of stuff, because we're seeing this leaving of play. Then we go back up, Sue Johnson, raised in a British pub, which I guess is the prerequisite to becoming 2016 American Psychological Association Psychologist of the Year. Below there, Martin Brokenleg, a Sue Rosebud elder, and author of a book that described the Circle of Courage model, which was widely used around not only North America, but around the world. There it is, Reclaiming Youth at Risk. It's called the Little Green Book because it's seen everywhere. And so he talked about how his own First Nations values and kind of the stories can impact the way we also think about raising our youth. Below that, Michael Ungar, he's one of the top social work scholars in the world. He's often ranked that high when it comes to citations and impact of publications. But what was Michael's big book? It was
well, there's lots. Yeah, it's Too Safe for Their Own Good was the one related to risk, but Change Your World, The Social Worker, he's written a fiction novel as well, which is quite good for social workers. You should read that one. He's 20 plus books, runs the International Resiliency Research Center at Dalhousie University. And so adolescence and resilience is kind of his lane and his area of expertise.
Yeah. And then now we're getting into left field here. We've got Bruce Lanphier. He's an environmental toxins researcher, was pivotal in talking about the dangers of lead-based paint, and all different types of toxins. So we're bringing the environment into this discussion. Below there, Ryan Rhodes, to oversimplify this pretty prolific researcher is to say his research is into why you've never successfully followed your New Year's resolution. So it's about how people make behavior change. And then Greg Montaigne, who was a leading he's just more recently retired, but a forensic psychiatrist who worked with in Ottawa, and tell me if I'm saying this right, just the most at-risk cases as the psychiatrist. So we've brought in this motley crew, and what we sort of did was kind of shut up and just ask what's going on with kids these days. And if you look at this sentiment, and we've probably all heard someone say, those damn kids these days. If you start digging, you find out that that's rumored, this sentiment, which we call the kids these days effect, has gone back to the Greek philosophers. So we're talking 400 to 600 BC. So this is really amazing that they were saying the kids these days are lazy, they don't make eye contact with their elders, they're disrespectful, they're self-absorbed, they're selfish. This is 600 BC. Another case study to this, relevant to the reason most of us are here, is Outward Bound was basically founded on the kids these days sentiment. Kurt Hahn famously said kids have spectatoritis. They're sitting in the stands and just watching. They're not engaged. And this was the 1930s, and Kurt Hahn said the kids these days are lazy because of advanced locomotion. 1930s. We had trains, and we were just a little more advanced than the Model T, the first Ford car. So it's really interesting that we're seeing this, and we found a big study about this kids these days sentiment. And what was really interesting is the people most likely to believe that kids were the laziest, most selfish, most unmotivated, most disrespectful, were the people who were ranked as the most intelligent, the most well-read, and as having the most conservative, as in, not conservative as in right or left or like that, but conservative as in social values. So you think of the baby boomers, they were called radical hippies that didn't go to church anymore, and they're often called the hardest working generation now. So one of the things we found is every young person grows up as a member of the shittiest, laziest generation until they're old enough to be the people that go to the moon and be the best generation. So we have this sort of this thing. It's like teenage amnesia, where as we get older, we forget what it's like to be a young person. And so we went out and talked to a lot of these people. And so we started asking these questions. And what we started seeing was not only threads that were relevant to our idea of talking about this, but there's also the reason I wanted to put this in the outdoor therapy series was Nevin and I didn't preface this with saying, hey, we want to talk about how outdoor therapies can save kids these days. By no means did we want to do that. And Nevin, I'll let you chime in here for a sec. Just about everybody talked about how important the outdoors was to positive youth development.
Yeah, and I to be honest, I thought at first it was just simply them trying to relate to us better. Like, because they know our work as well. And so I thought at first that was maybe just a little bit of homage and paying back all this wonderful stuff that we're getting from them. But almost everybody that we interviewed was able to provide clear examples from either their own life, their kids' life, or the kids that they've worked with, where the use or the integration of outdoor programming, risk-taking, adventures, camp, rites of passage experiences and so forth were super impactful. And to the degree that, Martin Brokenleg's book, The Little Green Book, influenced, at least in Canada and the United States and in South Africa, a huge swath of youth-based programming that used adventures. That's part and parcel with The Little Green Book, is that going out with groups on the land, doing adventurous experiential things is actually a part of the model that the Circle of Courage is based on. And so, yeah, we're not in any way intending to write anything about outdoor therapy specifically, but I do believe that all of our experts have directed us back to at least one excellent form of intervention or programming that should be a part of every kid's life.
Yeah. And so unfortunately, to start exploring what's actually going on with kids these days, and we use that a little bit tongue in cheek because there really isn't anything evolutionary or biologically different to kids these days, but there's things from the environment that are really changing what's going on. And so many of you know that self-harm is the leading cause of death. So this would be the World Health Organization labels it as self-harm instead of suicide. I'm not sure why, but in Canada, Australia, Russia, Japan, Germany, Ireland, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Belarus, and Iceland. Those are the countries where it's the leading cause of death. It's the second leading cause of death besides car accidents in the United States. And it's the second leading cause of death for young people and adolescents everywhere in the world, just about everybody who reports it. So we have a really big problem here when that's what our distressed young people, that's the out, is actually taking your own life. It's horrible. And so where we start with this drastic, horrible thing that happens, we also need to look at, well, what are we doing to stop it? So 8.5% in 2021 of young people were medicated for attention-related issues, autism. 1.2% in the United States were preschool aged, and 1 of every 8 young people, 12 to 17, were medicated. From 2015 to 2021, we've witnessed a 10% annual growth of antidepressant use. And look at this next line. Antipsychotics and medications used for ADHD experienced yearly increase at this time for preschoolers. In the United Kingdom, antidepressant use increased 26% for children under 17 from 2015 to 2020. No countries are experiencing this increase in antidepressant and stimulant use for attention-related issues more than the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. And so there's a few things, because I think when I watch the news, I kind of see COVID and the pandemic and the strategies used to fight the pandemic as sort of a cop-out in some ways. I think the pandemic was horrible, and I think there was increase in mental health stuff going on, but this has been happening for 20 years. This had these increases, and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And one of the theories that we've started to work with is by over medicating and also over therapizing and medicalizing everything, that a lot of us are becoming more and more uncomfortable with actually sitting with youth in distress. That we're trying to teach, and we'll get into this a little bit, that we're over teaching regulation skills where people aren't learning how to sit with uncomfortable, ugly feelings. Anything to add to this, Nevin?
Yeah, no, you're doing great.
Okay. And so we just need to look at what the research really says. This is from, I think, June. So we have a new SSRI that's approved by the Federal Drug Administration in the USA. Except note, suicidality is higher for the medication than placebo. Nine times higher for those who were prescribed this medication as opposed to those who were prescribed an inert pill. And I want to give the kind of disclaimer asterisk here. By no means am I anti-medication at all. The approach we're taking to this is what works. And the only way to answer that question is what works for who, not what works when we homogenize everybody into one group and try to sedate our way through difficult childhood behavior. And in that study, because most of us don't go read these things, the authors wrote that this drug reduced anxiety symptoms and was, quote, well tolerated in pediatric clients. So this study was used to approve this antidepressant use for children as young as 7. And for 50 years, we don't have SSRIs and ADHD medications that we actually tested and piloted on young people. So there's not many that are actually approved for use with children. So, and then you can see the quote that, the higher percentage, 9.5%, had suicidal ideation, with the most common ideation being in the least severe category, wish to be dead. So when we looked at this, we started thinking, well, maybe medicating is not the right thing that's happening here. Maybe we've got something. Maybe we need to look at the therapies, and maybe we can help people to talk their way out of this. So, and I've read this book. I've unblurred so I can show it to you. I highly recommend reading Sedated: How Modern Capitalism Created Our Mental Health Crisis. This is by James Davies, and he argues about how, he's from the UK as a psychiatrist, and in the United Kingdom as well as Australia, depression and anxiety are the leading cause of disability, with disability only being defined as you not being able to go to work. So if you work in a crappy workplace and you go, I can't go there anymore, it's terrible, I can't get out of bed with the notion of going to this place. If they label that as depression, the quickest thing you can do is medicate, and then you're back at sitting still at your workplace. So hence the idea of sedation, that we're not really solving the distress, we're putting a blanket on it. And so think about this when you go to your workplace and you see lovely self-care posters everywhere. Is it about you being radical, or is it about you sitting still? Because think about young people. It is only in the last 1%, less than 1% of human evolution, that children have been asked to sit still from 8:30 to 3:30 every day. And so it's really interesting when they don't sit still. And as Maggie Dent said, we have to stop stealing childhood in the name of education. So if it's not medication, we look at the talking therapies. This is going to make Graham very excited to talk about. You know, how long have we had psychotherapy? Well, we've had it for about 100 years. And over the last 50 years, we've gone from 60 to over 1,000 different empirically supported treatments, from CBT, DBT, ACT, and even you can think of the names we use in our field: adventure therapy, adventure-based counseling, wilderness therapy, outdoor behavioral health care, bush adventure therapy. That list just goes on, and it creates these tribal turf battles, right? But the problem is our outcomes have not improved ever, not even by 1%. But so we have, when we zoom away from actually thinking about the therapies, we kind of think, well, the average lifespan has increased exponentially. And we often think, well, that's because of better surgery, better this, better that. What the research really shows is it's really better prevention that is leading to better health outcomes for people. So how do we take a preventative approach to helping the kids of today, where it feels like our approach is often entirely reactional to what's going on? Okay, so I think that's probably a good time to open it up. Nevin, are you cool with that?
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
Is there anyone you can use the chat or unmute who want to add? What do you think is going on with the kids these days that's leading to this?
Maybe invite people to open up their mics and their cameras if they want to join in conversation-wise.
Yeah, or the chat, either one. Or not. We've put you to sleep with scary statistics.
Well, I was thinking maybe maybe we can just throw out a few examples of some of the things that are coming up in terms of themes in the book so far. I mean, the project, you want to call it a project yet. And my assumption is that very few of these things that we talk about will be surprising, but what we're doing is, again, talking to the experts, and many of them are saying, don't trust the experts, which is another whole other line of narrative that's growing in the book. But I mean, I'll start with a couple examples. One of them is early years. So early years, children aren't having the same types of experiences that they would have had, say, a couple generations ago. Ellen Sandcedar was talking about the natural sensation seeking that a child has is constrained in a school or indoor environments with adults that are trying to maintain some level of order with a group of children. And so anything that smacks of rough and tumble play that looks like aggression has been in essence removed from the early years relative to schools. And then kids are often not walking home, they're traveling home in vehicles because parents are concerned about stranger danger or them being hit by cars. And so kids aren't allowed to range, meaning go out unsupervised and do unstructured play as they used to. Generation by generation, this is being lost, and each generation is only seeing the previous generation as something that is foreign to them. So grandparents may be ranged kilometers from their home when they were kids, but their children only ranged maybe within blocks. And then the grandchildren are actually only playing with other kids in the backyard that's fenced and supervised. So this idea that kids just aren't having as much risk in their lives could be argued that that's a good thing. But some of our experts are saying, at what cost? They're missing something. And developmentally, what's being missed is an opportunity to explore their physicality with others, to explore conflict with others, to how to stay in a social relationship and keep their friends while also testing their fundamental movement skills by wrestling, boys and girls. And that's just one example that we're seeing. And so, yeah, the invitation is there for anyone who has any thoughts or comments about what they're maybe seeing with the youth that they're working with, or yeah, if you've got some ideas, I mean, we're open to hearing and talking about them.
So there's a few in the chat. So Liz says, what about breakdown of like family breakdown? So there is this, the largest study, it's called the happiness study. It comes out of Harvard, and it's the longest running. I think it started in the 50s. Actually, John F. Kennedy was a participant in this study. But one of the things they found was that they took people from different socioeconomic, so not just Harvard students, right? So people from different parts of Boston and stuff. And what they found was it wasn't their financials and their economic status that led to a happy adulthood. It was connection with family that was seriously important. And a mother's warmth was part of that terminology. There's another person, this gets to kind of Jen's point about existential and things like this, that Jean Twenge, I can't pronounce it very well. She's a psychologist. Her PhD was looking at trends of anxiety from the 1950s to the 1980s. And from the average young person with anxiety in the 1980s, so think average anxiety. So sometimes we use these terms like, I'm anxious about my job interview. Well, you're probably nervous, right? So we're talking about anxiety, not just nervousness. So the average anxiety for someone in the 1980s would have warranted institutionalization in the 1950s. So think about how much this has changed and where we are now. And what Jean found in her research is, again, it wasn't factors that we might usually think about, like socioeconomic status, where you live, things like this. It was social connection, and then the environment. What was happening in the 1980s? Cold War. Everyone thought we were all going to nuke everybody to death. And so we do have climate anxiety as a part of it as well in the environment. And so it's been really interesting. And what Gordon Neufeld, Maggie Dent, a lot of these people that we spoke to, it's teenagers are leaving the nest. And so it's very common for them to want to give their middle finger to their parents and their school teachers. And if we aren't there for other people's kids as a safe place, as regulated in our own way that we are building attachment, we're not holding on to our kids. So more than ever, they need other adults. If other adults aren't forming these attachments, they will have peer attachments. And that's Lord of the Flies. That's basically the thesis of Gordon Neufeld's book, Nevin, would you say?
Oh yeah, quite strongly so. Yeah. Yeah, a time when youth are probably not wanting to listen to their parents is probably, and guardians, is probably the time that at least other adults, role models, need to be in their lives, because otherwise they're making moral and value and maybe even ethical decisions about who they are in this world and what their identity is from an immature, impulsive peer, as opposed to an adult who can provide the care and the safe setting, the emotional playground, Gordon likes to call them, right? So creating emotional playgrounds of safety for kids to have those big feelings and to work through stuff is his sort of model of healthy development versus one, getting kids to look after themselves, right? The self-care model, which both Gordon Neufeld and another expert, Michael Unger, kind of take a fairly critical stance against some of the self-help industry, which actually includes putting, and this sounds very controversial, but when it's thought about and talked about, it's not, the idea of bringing, say, mindfulness programs to 7 and 8-year-olds in a classroom. So you're trying to teach 7 and 8-year-olds how to meditate when you know that it has some positive benefits for self-care. But our experts are saying, well, it's actually the adult in the room that has to be providing the care and the social context for people to have real emotions and not just self-regulate, control your own behaviors, right? Because I need to keep managing this classroom. And so I'm just noticing there's lots of really rich comments and questions coming up in the chat box. Will, I'm not sure what process there will be to address these as we go through.
Yeah, we can just keep looking at them.
I'd like to speak to one thing that Jen, I don't want to leave your comment behind about environmental catastrophe and the degradation of the environment. And one of the things that we have started writing about is this idea of generational amnesia, and that we only see changes in the environment based on our worldview and what we've seen in terms of, like, I'm in my 50s now, so I've seen 50 years of the world, so I have this perspective on what's changed, but I don't have my parents' perspective on what's changed or their parents' perspective on what's changed. And so we tend not to actually see how much things have changed, and that can be positive or negative, right? There's benefits, things that are happening on a positive scale, some environments that are actually being restored. And my concern with climate related issues is the way that media can portray messaging that is fear inducing. And I think our young people do not do well with fear mongering and messages that are negative and scary, whereas they can still learn to fall in love with nature. They can still learn to be in awe of all the bits and pieces of the planet and nature around them, which makes them more likely to be in relationship with them, where nature becomes, a kinship with nature. And then we're more likely to want to protect it. Whereas when you're inducing anxiety by fearful messages, I think you tend to create the wrong effect. And one of our experts, Bruce Lanphier, in talking about environmental toxins, which is a terrifying conversation that we had with Bruce about what's really going on. And he's one who clearly says, do not trust the experts, because there are toxins in our environments globally that should not be. Forever chemicals, poisons, things that have quote unquote allowable limits where they should not have. But they're based on old research and science that says, well, a little bit's not harming anybody, but a little bit adds up to a little bit year after year. And I think our work is starting to show that there's all sorts of environments that are causing little bits of harm that are adding up to our youth being in the state that they're in today, where they're taking their own lives. Like, why would anybody in that 15 to 30 years of age, why would anybody be seeing the world in a way that it's not worth living? I mean, that's the time when people should have the most vim and vigor for life and its potential and who they're going to become in the world. And so I'm hoping that we're able to construct a narrative that's a little more on the the positive side and not in any way fear mongering, even though we have some fairly scary messages to share.
Well, I think another thing getting to with young people is that we're seeing that a lot of the words that a lot of the terms that we use really come out of Freud's textbook, being triggered, things like this. But like, I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. It's what's really interesting is we've really equipped everybody with mental health language and terminology, where people might say, I'm a little bit OCD. And so we're seeing this self-labeling at younger and younger ages now. And in California, they did a study of, I think it was 600 or 6,000. This is one of those moments where the researcher should have this in front of them. Let's go with 600, still a lot. And so they asked 600 sixth graders, do you have a mental illness? And for those who self-identified as yes, I do, when they were surveyed again in 8th grade, 2 years later, those who had dropped that label had the biggest increase in self-esteem. Those who kept the label had reductions in self-esteem, even if their mental health symptomology checklist did not change. So we're tending to give these labels, which make it who is the psychiatrist we just interviewed last week?
Greg.
Greg. As Greg said, when you have young people in and out of hospital, in and out of doctors, what happens is he's talking about working with First Nations young people in Canada, showing up with bags of medication that have forgotten which label is which. And his work was most often about reducing the impact the label has on the person, because we know that between 12 and 14, everything about adolescence is identity formation. This is what Eric Erickson was talking about. And if the climate and the environment that we are all living in as the adults with power is all about labeling and identity, we know that that can become very real for people. I see this is blowing up in an interesting...
I've got a few responses here, Will. I just was reading through the comments, and I know I don't have a name, but Crecimiento y Aventura, just your comments about the fact that not all environments with adults in them are safe spaces for kids. And we obviously have to recognize that. It's difficult in writing, even though we've worked in different places internationally. The reality is that the book has to be written through sort of this modern Western lens, and primarily books are sold in the United States. So a lot of our statistics are looking at Canada, Australia, a little bit of Europe and the United States. But just the same, whether it's out in the community, at church, in schools, we don't necessarily know what our kids are up to and whether or not the adults are providing healthy, meaningful guidance for our kids. And it's one of the reasons why I'm just going to show the cover here. The title of Gordon Neufeld's book, which I think is now in its 3rd printing, is Hold On to Your Kids, Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Peers, is such a strong thesis in terms of we have to provide the primary caregiving space with adults, parents. That extends with obviously community, family, aunties, uncles, coaches, those people that are around us. Even if our kids are, Will and I both have been through raising teens. So even if my teenagers are not listening to me, when they hear other adults that are friends and in our community saying the same thing, it locks in. They're like, okay, maybe my dad's got something there, or maybe there is something to this. And so they hang on to that. And so that, just as a framework, is obviously one of our major recommendations, is be involved in your kids' lives, be involved with your kids' coaches, be involved with your teachers and what's happening in the classrooms. And that's just super important. There was another point here that I was just wanting to make. Debbie was talking about teachers being unable to self-regulate. Right. So if they can't put themselves in a good state of their own autonomic nervous system, what capacity are they going to have for helping co-regulate or teach a child to self-regulate? It's not necessarily the case. And the last one, Jen, to your comment about juvenile crime rates lower than in the last 50 years, and that's a global trend. Bruce Lanphier, one of our interviewees, his major area of research is lead toxicity. The reason that the crime rates, and especially with juvenile crime rates, have dropped, they peaked in 1994, 1995, and have dropped to almost zero, at least in Canada, has to do with the fact that lead was removed from gasoline for sale to the public in automobiles in the middle of the 1980s. That's the legacy effect of lead that led to a peak in crime in the 1990s. It's the reason why New York City, the crime rates completely disappeared under Mayor Rudy Giuliani. And he claimed responsibility for that when in fact it had to do with a direct correlation with lead. It's been proven over and above as the crime of the century, but it never got a lot of press because it involved a lot of corporations, from previously knowing that lead was toxic to using it as a product that increased the life of engines and made auto manufacturers. And there's a corporate collusion corruption side to that story, which we're going to let Bruce publish in his book that's coming out next year. But that's one of those things. It's like, okay, we asked him what else is going on, and then he started talking about herbicides and pesticides that are still allowed to be put on crops in North America that aren't allowed in Europe, and the detrimental effects they're having on IQ scores, on behavioral realities for children, cognitive development being delayed, on and on and on. Fluorine that's used in many of our medications because it's good at targeting whatever the active ingredient is in the drug. Atrazine, which is an endocrine disruptor, so it's actually messing with hormones in the body. Canada just renewed 11 of 12 products for agriculture that have this product atrazine in it. Bruce Lanphier has just publicly resigned as co-chair of the Committee for Oversight and Transparency for Pesticide Use in Canada because they didn't listen to the experts. The experts said atrazine has to go. We have to ban it like Europe did years ago. It should not be allowed to be used. And yet they pulled it from one of 12 products. So that's having long-term detrimental effects on learning capacity, development, IQ, like all these things are now being correlated. And so our kids are at risk. Our kids are at risk, and it's terrifying and frustrating. And at the same time, we can't count on our regulatory agencies or our quote unquote experts to protect our kids from these harms. Bruce Lanphier gave us a term, we're using it as a chapter title, but he said, it's not the, what did he say? It's not the lions, tigers, and bears anymore that we have to look out for. The predators are still out there. And as parents and adults, we have to look out for our children. The predators are, and he started listing things from lead to mercury to whatever. And I'm starting to ramble.
No, but I also think it's such an important look at what the part that is. This was interesting because we didn't know what Bruce would give us, and it really moved in our kind of outline of this project. It kept moving up towards the front, that what's going on here, because you can also look at, I mean, I'm in South Australia and Adelaide, where in our wastewater we have crystal meth because we have a huge ice problem here. In Sweden, there are fish with traces of antidepressants in them. So not only microplastics, we're also seeing this use so much that these medications, that the testing of them is very weary, For example, one of the things we talk about with these medications is when you're doing a clinical trial for, let's say, an antidepressant for depression, there's no comorbidity, right? And anyone who's worked with clients know no one just has depression, right? They come to you with one problem and one problem only. And this is how clinical trials are phrased. So they they're so not naturalistic in the way these studies are, and then they get FDA approved and thrown out without really people. This is what Bruce is warning us about. We're trusting the regulatory bodies to make the right decisions. And Nevin and I have already been in this fight with how is the National Association of Social Workers approving young people being kidnapped in the middle of the night by people paid by their parents to go to the woods? How's that possible? And so it's kind of interesting that what we have found that's really bad. But the other side of it, that's the part that's the way kind of out of this, is to really, we have to ditch this the kids these days sort of thing and be with them and be a part of their journey and know that the heroism of youth is really, even in therapy in the counseling room, your client is the wild card of what, if they're going to get better or not. So can we, Nevin used this great metaphor that, like, you cannot teach your child how to walk. It's impossible. Your child will do it. Your job as the parent is to make sure they're not learning to walk next to 10 flights of stairs or a really sharp corner, that they have a safe place to walk. And when they fall down and they look at you, most of us have seen, when like a 3 to 5-year-old falls over and they don't know if they should cry yet, and then they stare at you, and then if you run over, they'll lose it, right? I think quite often we're not really running over and sitting with them. We're looking at kind of easy fixes to when the young person is in distress. And we're getting nervous about young people in distress instead of going, yeah, it really stinks for someone to break up with you. Like, let's go out for a coffee. Like, really being in proximity with each other.
I think, well, I'd like to go back to a comment made earlier by Nicole as well. She just said, I think in the past, children, teens have had purpose and work to do. They felt valued in this. They also felt valued in a supportive family who largely had their stuff together and modeled good conflict resolution, etc. I think one of the beautiful things in doing this project was getting a chance to reconnect with Martin Brokenleg and the Circle of Courage model, because it was hugely impactful on my work as a youth worker in the mid-1990s. And that model was based on the medicine wheel, and the 4 quadrants of the medicine wheel were belonging, mastery, independence, and generosity. And that became the model, which was then used to like design youth work interventions, to design treatment programs, to design cultural programs for doing regenerative cultural work in Indigenous communities. But the mastery piece was about developing skills. So often through observation and role modeling what the adults are doing, children had the ability to develop new skills. They also saw that those skills were inclusive of things like caring for each other. And so when a child sees and feels that they are being cared for by their mother, their father, their auntie, their uncle, someone else in the community, they also then get to see that when they become skilled, when they have mastery over those skills, and they become independent as an individual and not reliant on the adult, that they then have a role to serve back to the younger. So that older, wiser one, that older, bigger one that can provide the care model, also incorporates the concept of belonging. I belong here. I have a role. And I think that's one of the areas that, to your comment, that maybe children in the past had a sense of more of a role in the family, and that they were then expected to provide or serve in return at some point. And families that stuck together, multi-generational families, know this intimately because they're still looking after each other. Grandparents are looking after children, and our modern methods of locomotion can take us so far away, right, that we're separate from and not together at times, and it makes it harder to be in family and gain that sense of belonging. The last thing that just triggered a thought is to the same extent, Kurt Hahn, again, one of the founders of the Outward Bound programs that do outdoor education around the world, he had said there is no one here is crew, right? Or no, everyone is crew. There are no passengers on this ship. So the idea that no one got a free ride, that everybody was crew and had to be a part of the success of an expedition. And that's kind of the same. And if kids aren't growing up with a sense of meaning and that they have some role in a family, then yeah, they're probably without that sense of modeling what they're going to become, and that compromises identity as well. We can't leave it up to them figuring that out with their peers on social media. We have to be heavily involved.
And I think this is a good, because we are supposed to be talking about outdoor therapy, but I won't show you any more books because that's book overload. But Nevin and I, along with a bunch of other people, wrote this paper that we're under review. But one of the things in the Outward Bound literature, Kurt Hahn talked about, and when, especially when the process was kind of, they're trying to figure out what's actually going on here, they talked about the student being oriented towards mastery. So it doesn't mean by learning to make a fire, you're now oriented to being successful in other ways. So it's not really about climbing, not climbing, getting to the top of the mountain, this and that, but really about the worker sort of, the worker is leading the client to thinking about their own mastery, to thinking about what they can control, to being a part of this. And I know the word control is really odd, but the first time, and we looked back into this, the first time success and mastery was used together was in the 1930s at the first ever adolescent psychotherapy conference in the APA. This has been a core component of effective psychotherapy, as far as I can see, until about the 1970s, when we decided to stop talking about it. Mm-hmm. And so outdoor education has been oriented towards mastery for a long time and success. And the idea of it was, and they said, I'll paraphrase here, but in the 1930s, they were saying the most effective way to do psychotherapy with young people is to be oriented towards success and mastery. And this was tested with adults at an inpatient clinic at Johns Hopkins University in the 60s. And what they did was they gave people with severe and persistent mental illness tasks to do. Now, this is going to be contraindicated for many of us. The researchers formed no therapeutic relationship, none. They were just researchers. They weren't asking what the people, they weren't asking about feelings, auditory hallucinations, anything. They weren't talking about trauma either. And they gave them things to do. And it was a game that tested your response rate. So I imagine it like that first, like an Atari video game, like really simple with a ball moving side to side or something. And the research participants, these clients with severe and persistent mental illness, were split into two groups. One group was given a placebo pill, so a pill that was totally fake. And one group was given, one group, the researcher said, wow, you're really getting good at this. Look at how much better you've gotten. Look at how you're able to pay attention really well. At the end of the study, when they left this inpatient clinic, they couldn't find a difference in outcomes. But 6 months later, the placebo group started to relapse. A year later, most of the placebo group was back in inpatient care. And the people who were oriented towards self-determination, success, and mastery were way above. So at times, I also think living on planet mental health and nowadays planet trauma, we're missing kind of we can be missing exactly what Mache said about missing out on imagination and possibility, and working with young people based on what makes them amazing. And that, we sort of argue, is the way out of kids these days, is by really embracing the heroism of youth. And this is something I think outdoor people naturally kind of get, because we know that the young people have to know they matter. when they're out in the bush. They're not, they aren't a passive recipient. You've got a question, Nevin?
No, I just responded to Courtney and her earlier comment about modern technology and how some of, I'll say, us adults are struggling with, becoming engaged and participating in modern technology. And I think most of our experts are saying, yeah, there's nothing, we're not anti-technology, but there has to be, what did Mari Swingle say? Not disruption, not integrate, digital interference versus digital integration, right? So whether you're the 9-year-old or the 12-year-old or the 52-year-old, if you're gaming too much or watching, social media, or you're scrolling too much, or, whatever that becomes an almost an addictive behavior, like that is something that needs to be addressed. Digital integration, good. Digital interference, bad, and needs to be addressed. However, I think most of our experts would also say that there is no social media or technology that can replace quality human face-to-face interaction and relationship.
Yeah.
From
And Maggie said
an
this.
eye to a hug to physical contact, there's not much that can actually replace that. So it's a both and scenario as opposed to an either or.
Yeah. And Maggie said this about parenting, and this is a challenge for all of us as we wrap up here in a second. That Maggie Dent said one of the worst things that happened with the phone is that all of us bring our work home. So you've picked up your kid from school, you drive them home from school or whatever your process is, and then you go, I'm just going to do 20 minutes of emails. And that time of connection where your 3-year-old needs you for that attachment is missing in that very moment when we get them, that we go back to work. And I know I'm horrible at this because I work all the time. So that's my call to action for myself. Thank you for such an engaging conversation. Every time we talk about it, I'm left going, yeah, I need to go get a cabin so we can finish this thing and get away from everybody.
Yeah.
But I hope you enjoyed the Will and Nevin, what we've been working on and what we're trying to piece together, because it is heavy and it is a lot. But I also think, I know that effective therapy is hard, but I don't think effective therapy is rocket science either. It doesn't have to be that for all of us. And yeah, the recording will have the screen as well, Alicia. Well, with that, I will let you all go. Have a night. Mache is going to hang out in the PJs some more. And if you're in Australia, we have to go to work. Nevin, what's the name of the little green book? Reclaiming Youth at Risk, right?
Reclaiming Youth at Risk, yeah. Martin Broken Leg is one of 3 authors on it.
Awesome. Great,
yeah, maybe
everybody. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's all good. All good. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, I will see you all.